Dating and relationships are often confusing, complicated, and even at times a little bit scary. But if you're a nerd, then you might have a tendency to try and compare yourself to different types of people, such as gym buffs or extroverted party animals, and then come to the conclusion, how can I compete with that? Well, in this video, I'm going to attempt to shine the light on what it means to be a nerd from the perspective of dating and relationships, some of the biggest misconceptions, and how you can maximize your chances to find a long-term, healthy, and compatible partner. I think the best place to start is understanding your own strengths and what you as a nerd bring to the table. So in order to be able to do this, I think it helps to actually understand what a nerd is. And my definition of a nerd is someone who is unconventionally passionate about something, often to an irrational extent. I know if you follow the stereotypes, then it might lead you to think that a nerd is a dorky guy with glasses, maybe lacking in social skills, doesn't have many friends, maybe even has been picked on or bullied when they were younger or in school. But in my opinion, these aren't the underlying characteristics of a nerd. A nerd is simply someone who is unconventionally passionate about something, and usually that thing is a little less mainstream. This is why you could be a comic book nerd, a video game nerd, a science nerd, business nerd, and many others too, because the underlying quality is that you're very passionate about a particular field. Having said that though, there seems to be a few universal aspects that nerds seem to struggle with when it comes to dating and relationships, and I certainly did up until fairly recently when I came to the following conclusion. In theory, the person who you're going to spend more time with than anyone else over the course of your lifetime, including your own kids, is your future romantic partner. So I think it makes sense to put in some time and effort to try and understand this aspect of life, dating and relationships, so you're in the best possible place to make the best decisions and that you can understand this in more detail. So I think one thing to keep in mind when it comes to future relationships is that there's nothing worse than a dull relationship where there's no life, no positivity, and no energy. And in theory, if you think about it, well, nerds don't actually struggle with this area because they are by definition very passionate. So if they're able to channel those passions and direct them in a productive way towards or helping the relationship, then you often won't suffer from that very pitfall. The way I like to think of it is that passions are a catalyst for adventure and intrigue because they're motivators. They're something that energizes you and allows you to direct your time and attention into something that you care about. Ultimately, relationships and even life as a whole is a bit of an adventure. So when it comes to attracting someone, most people are drawn to someone who's actually going places or has an interesting story to tell and be a part of. I think broadly speaking, you can break nerds down into two categories, the extroverted category and the introverted category. And the extroverts tend to be a bit more vocal about their passions, what they're enthusiastic about, and where they'd like to go. Whereas the introverts tend to be a bit more quiet and thrives less in social environments. I think what extroverted nerds tend to misunderstand is that a lot of their charisma actually stems from their nerdiness and those underlying passions. So being able to channel them socially and vocally often makes you more appealing and more charismatic overall. Introverted nerds, on the other hand, it's going to be less about your social charisma and more about what you do with those passions that will make you alluring and intriguing to others. So for example, if you're a nerdy, introverted, tech enthusiast or engineer, and a lot of what your passions are is to build something or create something, whether it's software or something physical, then a lot of your appeal is going to be coming from that particular aspect. It's not going to be what you say you're going to do or how charismatic you come across, but a lot of it is what you actually can accomplish, or to be able to channel your passions in a way that from an external audience, it will seem like, wow, this person is onto something, this person is channeling those passions and their energy in something constructive. I think very quickly it's probably worth making the distinction between someone who's naturally introverted and they don't quite have the interest in being around large crowds or other people versus someone who actually does have the interest but they're lacking in the self-esteem or the social confidence. If you are in that latter category, then I have made some videos in the past that delves into this topic and how you can boost your own self-esteem, but I also plan on going into this in more detail in future videos, so keep an eye out if you're interested in that. The other thing that's often associated with nerdiness is intelligence or intellect, and there's even a term for people who are drawn to this very quality, and that is sapiosexual. I think many nerds often assume that the qualities that actually make them nerdy is an actual turn-off for most people, but in reality, those underlying traits of passion, intelligence, intellect, and even other kind of external or surrounding traits such as loyalty and kindness are often really highly desired by the other person and any future partner. Seeing as there's roughly 8 billion people on this planet, and let's just assume you're only interested in one of the sexes, that means that there could be up to 4 billion potential candidates out there. But in reality, this is far too big a number for you to realistically be able to make a good decision on, and most of them are not actually going to be a good partner. So how do you know which ones to actually focus on, or more generally, how can you actually attract the ones with the most potential? When you view things from this perspective, it really makes sense that it's not in your interest to attract an incompatible partner. And the biggest mistake that nerds make is that they dilute their own nerdy qualities and try to play to the masses or the mainstream. This can be best seen on dating apps, where many nerds often assume that it's best to suppress or hide that aspect of yourself because it wouldn't be deemed as an attractive quality, and instead do all the things that are stereotypically seen as attractive or desirable, and the end result of this is that you just end up coming across a little bit bland to most people, and you're not actually trying to attract most people or be in a relationship with most people, you're just looking for that one person who will actually make for a really good partner. The single biggest tip that I have for nerds on dating apps is to really kind of crank up that authenticity, and rather than playing those kind of mainstream or conventional cards, dial up the aspects that make you who you are, and if they include nerdy qualities, then so be it. If you think about it, if broadcasting a more authentic version of yourself turns off 99% of people, but increases the likelihood and the interest in that 1% who actually would make for a long-term compatible partner, then it's definitely worth the trade. Even if you were hypothetically attractive to every single person on this planet, there'd be far too many people and far too many choices to go through in order to actually converge on the best possible partner. Instead, what you can do is use your own interests, your own personality traits, and your own uniqueness to filter out the competition so that you end up focusing on the ones that actually have the best possible odds. So what this does is it essentially reframes your own personality and your own self-image so that it can be viewed less like a limitation or constraint and more like a point of focus. And then through that focus, you can end up broadcasting the right kind of signals to attract the people who would be most drawn to you and make for the best partner, rather than broadcasting a very mainstream signal that most people are kind of interested in, but probably have someone who broadcasts the right kind of signals for them. So the next thing probably worth talking about is how to make the first move. So let's say you found someone who you're attracted to, whether that's on a dating app or in person, and you're trying to get their attention and hopefully turn it into a more romantic or dating environment. I think if it's a dating app, then it's probably a good idea to try and focus on something on their profile that resonates with you personally. So it could be a location that they've been to, a movie that they enjoy, or even some kind of event that you tend to go to that they also go to. So it turns out that while the phrase opposites attract has some truth in it, but it usually really applies to femininity and masculinity in a kind of general context. In reality, people are often drawn to some kind of shared interests, something in common, and you can see this on the dating profiles, and the stats seem to show that people are often drawn to you or drawn to each other based on something that they have in common, and this could be nationality, religion, shared interests, and many more. But maybe you've come across someone in person and you don't actually have this insight to know what they have in common with you, or maybe you've even come across someone online but there's no obvious entry point into conversation. What do you do then? I think this is where a little bit of assertiveness can go a long way, but also view assertiveness less like something that you have naturally and more like something like a skill that you can develop over time. The thing is, if you're a nerd, then that usually comes with certain qualities such as passion, loyalty, and attentiveness. So in many ways, if you broadcast that kind of nerdy personality, then people often don't doubt that you have those qualities. Instead, it's the assertive qualities that generally are the ones that they will test for. But if you're able to practice assertiveness, then this can go a long way because it shows to the other person that you're not just a nerd who doesn't know what to do with their passions. Instead, you actually have the boldness and the assertiveness to actually channel that particular passion or your personality in general towards some kind of direction, and this usually creates the subtle signs of an interesting adventure or story. So let's say you've now reached a certain level of comfort or skill when it comes to starting conversations with people who you're interested in. What comes next is the more general conversation and how to keep a conversation flowing and to show someone what you have to offer, as well as to get to know them more. I'd say a good rule of thumb is to play to your strengths. So if they're asking questions about you, then definitely lean towards areas that you feel competent in, that you have that knowledge, understanding, and also interest in. But at the same time, it's about showing curiosity for the other person. And the kind of phrase that always comes back to me is that you have one mouth and two ears, so use them in that particular ratio, particularly if you're a guy and you're trying to date a woman. Women typically value safety, security, and attentiveness very highly. So if you're able to create an environment where they're both emotionally and physically safe, then they'll feel a lot more comfortable sharing their inner world with you, and this is kind of a prerequisite for a long-term healthy relationship. They need to feel like they're heard, they're understood, and that you're curious and you're willing to go to the effort to make them feel like they're heard. So if you want to know more information about what women find more desirable generally about men outside of the nerd-specific domain, then I've made a video about this fairly recently. I've also made the opposite video, which is what men find attractive in women, and this takes into account a lot of evolutionary psychology. So when it comes to dating more broadly, one thing that's very underrated is the environment. And the environment really does matter when it comes to creating an atmosphere that is conducive of romance and that kind of chemistry that can lead to something long term. So for example, if you're very organized, you might have a tendency to try and schedule everything into your calendar. And one of the side effects of this is that if you really care about efficiency, you might think that it's a good idea to maybe book dates at a particular time that's outside of your usual window. So for example, before work at 7 or 8 a.m, it could be a good opportunity to go for a coffee date or something like that. But in reality, it's very hard to create that romantic atmosphere. Before work's even started, they're often tired, they haven't had their coffee yet, so you don't see them in the best possible light. And despite the fact that in theory you could actually be very compatible, if you don't create an environment that actually facilitates that compatibility, then it often won't lead to anything that you actually want in the long term. So just as the time is important, so too is the specific venue. And when it comes to organizing a date, it's usually a good idea to pick a location or create an atmosphere that is playful and dynamic and positive, because that way you can learn something about the other person in an environment that isn't overly too intense. This is particularly true if you're a nerd. So rather than picking something like a nightclub, which most nerds don't thrive in, instead gravitate towards something a little bit more playful, a little bit more authentic, and something that you can both feel comfortable in. So this could be something like a bar that facilitates board games, or some kind of activity like mini golf. This usually is a much better environment to create that kind of spark or romantic energy between you. So the last part of this video is the transition between dating and relationships. And like I've alluded to before, dating is more of a skill. It's something that you get better with over time because you become more comfortable in those kind of environments. So if you're not having much luck with dating, it probably means at least one of two things. Either you're picking the wrong types of partners, in which case go back to what I was saying about broadcasting the right kinds of signals, or it could mean that you just haven't built up that skill set when it comes to dating. Because like I said, through practice and repetition, you get a lot better at being yourself if that's actually what you're trying to optimize for. And when it comes to relationships, there's one particular key ingredient that really facilitates them, and that is shared vulnerability. It's very hard to make a relationship work if you don't have that. So this is why I think really embracing that nerdy aspect to you, because it might not seem like it's a strength, but embracing the fact that you're very good at some things and not in others can really create that environment where you're able to embrace each other's strengths and weaknesses, open up, and create a nurturing, healthy emotional environment. You can even break down shared vulnerability a little bit more and focus on things such as humility, which is the ability to acknowledge where you're wrong or that you don't have all the answers. And then the shared aspect can be broken down into understanding, because without trying to understand the other person and having that mutual understanding between you, then it's very hard to create that long-term healthy relationship. So with this video, I really wanted to focus on principles rather than specific pieces of advice, because I think everyone has different circumstances, But feel free to leave any comments or suggestions down below, or even if you have any specific questions that you don't think I've covered, feel free to leave them in the comments section. But for now, that's all for this one. If you enjoyed, then feel free to like or subscribe. Otherwise, I'll see you in the next video.